After 27 years of marriage, my husband looked me in the eye and said I was too old to be loved. He wanted someone younger, someone fresh, but when I whispered my secret, his face turned ash white. He never knew. Please subscribe and like my 10 p.m. stories, one story every night. It truly helps these tales touch more hearts. Share where you're listening from in the comments. Seeing our growing family from around the world always brings me joy. Now, let the story unfold. If you discovered that the person you built your entire life around was only waiting for your beauty to fade, what would you do? Would you weep, or would you reach for the one secret that could dismantle their entire world? Tonight, I'm sharing how 27 years of loyalty ended in a single afternoon of cold betrayal, and why being replaced was the most expensive mistake my husband ever made. Listen closely. Some debts are never truly paid. The air in our dining room tasted like expensive wax and forced smiles. We had just celebrated 27 years. 27 years of me packing his lunches, ironed shirts, and keeping the silence when his temper flared. David sat across from me, his salt and pepper hair perfectly groomed, his eyes fixed on the condensation dripping down his wine glass. He looked successful, the kind of man who had conquered the world and expected a trophy for it. I was that trophy once, but trophies gather dust. I reached across the mahogany table to touch his hand, my skin feeling the faint map of age that had begun to claim us both. He flinched. It wasn't a violent movement, just a subtle withdrawal, like a cat avoiding a puddle. The sting was sharper than any slap. Outside, the wind rattled the oak trees, sounding like dry bones hitting the window pane. I noticed he was wearing a new cologne, something sharp, citrusy, and much too young for a man nearing 60. "You're quiet tonight, David," I said, my voice barely a ripple in the heavy air. I could feel my heart hammering against my ribs, a frantic bird in a cage. He didn't look up. He just traced the rim of his glass with a manicured finger. The silence stretched until it felt like it would snap and cut us both. I remembered the smell of his old soap, the one that used to mean safety. Now there was only this strange synthetic citrus and a distance I couldn't bridge. I felt a sudden, icy chill settle in the small of my back, a premonition that the floor was about to vanish beneath my feet. He finally looked up, and his eyes were as cold as the winter sea. "I've signed the papers, Elena," he said. The words didn't make sense at first. I looked at the sideboard, thinking he meant the insurance documents or the new deed for the summer house. But his posture was rigid, his jaw set in that aggressive line he used when firing a junior associate. He wasn't talking about business, he was talking about us. He reached into his breast pocket and pulled out an envelope, sliding it across the table like a death warrant. The light from the chandelier caught the gold band on his finger, the band I'd placed there when we were 23 and broke. My stomach dropped, that sickening roller coaster sensation that leaves your mouth tasting like copper. I didn't open the envelope. I didn't need to. The citrus smell of his cologne seemed to fill the room now, suffocating and alien. I looked down at my hands. They were trembling so violently I had to tuck them under my thighs. 27 years, David, I whispered. My voice sounded like it belonged to a stranger, someone much older and much more tired. He stood up then, smoothing his suit jacket with a chillingly casual grace. He didn't look at me with hate, which would have been easier to bear. He looked at me with pity. That was the moment I felt the first real crack in my soul, a jagged line that started in my chest and tore downward. "You're a good woman, Elena," he said, and the word good felt like an insult. "But I've spent my life building an empire, and I want to enjoy the rest of it with someone who matches my energy, someone who hasn't given up." He looked at my face, at the fine lines around my eyes, with a clinical detachment that made me want to scream. He didn't know I had already seen her photo in his briefcase. I had found the photo 3 days ago. I wasn't snooping, I was looking for his spare car keys. It was a Polaroid, tucked behind a stack of legal briefs. She was young, no more than 25, with hair the color of spun honey and a smile that hadn't yet been burdened by the reality of a mortgage or a sick child. Standing in our garden, wearing a summer dress I'd never seen, she looked like a light bulb in a dark room. Looking at David now, I realized he didn't see a partner in me anymore. He saw a ledger of his own mortality. Every wrinkle on my face reminded him that he was aging too. To him, this girl wasn't just a lover. She was a fountain of youth he could buy with the money we had saved together. I felt a wave of nausea, the kind that makes your skin feel too tight for your bones. The smell of the roasting chicken from the kitchen, a meal I had spent hours preparing for our anniversary, now smelled like burning rubber. "Her name's Mia, isn't it?" I asked. The name felt like a piece of broken glass in my mouth. David froze, his hand on the back of his chair. He hadn't expected me to know. For a second, a flicker of guilt crossed his face, but it was quickly replaced by a defiant iron mask. He straightened his tie, a gesture of vanity that made me realize he had already checked out of our life months, maybe years ago. He stepped toward the door, leaving the envelope sitting between the crystal salt shakers. "I've bought her a place in the city. You can keep this house. It's too big for me now anyway. It feels heavy." He walked out, the click of his expensive loafers echoing on the hardwood like a ticking clock. The house felt like a tomb the moment the front door slammed. I sat at that table for 4 hours, watching the candles burn down until they drowned in their own wax. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was a loud, ringing vacuum that pressed against my eardrums. I could hear the house settling, the creak of the floorboards, the hum of the refrigerator, all sounds that used to mean home, but now sounded like a countdown. I finally opened the envelope. The terms were generous in the eyes of the law, but they were a pittance compared to what he was actually worth. David had always handled the finances. He was the genius investor, the man with the Midas touch. I had trusted him blindly, signing papers over the years without a second glance, because that's what we did. We were a team. Or so I thought. My fingers felt numb as I flipped through the pages, the paper feeling cold and sharp. I walked to his study, my feet heavy as if I were walking through deep water. The room still smelled like his cigars and old leather. I sat in his high-backed chair and looked at the safe in the corner. He thought I didn't know the code. He thought I was just the wife who picked out the curtains and remembered the birthdays. But 27 years is a long time to live with someone. You learn their patterns. You learn the numbers they use when they think no one is watching. My heart was thumping so hard I could see my pulse in my vision. I knelt before the safe, my knees clicking on the rug. I punched in his mother's birth date. The lock clicked. It was a small sound, but in that empty house, it sounded like a gunshot. The door swung open, revealing a stack of documents he had never mentioned. The first thing I pulled out was a deed to a property in the Cayman Islands. It wasn't in his name. It was in the name of a shell company I had never heard of. My breath hitched. I flipped through more files, bank statements from Switzerland, transfer records to accounts I didn't recognize, and a secret ledger hidden in the back. David hadn't just been investing our money, he had been siphoning it away for a decade. He had been planning his exit since our 20th anniversary. While I was planning our future, he was building a fortress where I wasn't invited. I felt a cold, hard knot form in my stomach. The sadness was being replaced by something sharper, a crystalline rage that made my hands stop shaking. I realized that the generous settlement he offered was a distraction to keep me from looking into the accounts he had bled dry. I found a small velvet box at the bottom of the safe. For a moment, my heart softened. I thought maybe it was a gift he had forgotten to give me. I opened it. Inside was a diamond necklace, teardrop stones that caught the dim light of the study. There was a receipt tucked under the cushion. It was dated last Tuesday. The "sold to" line didn't say Elena, it said Mia. The weight of the betrayal felt like a physical blow to my chest. I sat on the floor of the dark study, surrounded by the evidence of 27 years of deception. I looked at the necklace. its beauty feeling like a mockery. That's when I saw the small black USB drive taped to the underside of the safe's top shelf. It was labeled with a date from 30 years ago, before we were even married. I plugged the drive into his laptop, my pulse racing in my throat. I expected more bank accounts, maybe more photos of the girl. Instead, a series of scanned police reports and old newspaper clippings filled the screen. My eyes scanned the headlines. Warehouse fire ruled accident, 1 dead. I scrolled down. The fire had happened at a textile company David had worked for right before he started his own firm. The victim was his boss at the time, a man who had been a mentor to David. The reports were standard, but there was a handwritten note scanned at the end of the file. It was a confession, written in David's youthful, shaky script, but never sent. It detailed how the fire wasn't an accident. It was a way to cover up an embezzlement scheme David had started. He had killed a man to hide a theft, and then used the insurance payout to build the empire he was so proud of. I felt like I was looking at a monster I slept next to for half my life. Every kiss, every I love you, every anniversary was built on the ashes of a murdered man. David wasn't a success story, he was a fugitive who got away with it. The citrus smell of his cologne seemed to haunt the room again, making me gag. I wasn't just a discarded wife. I was the only person who now held the power to send the great David Vance to a prison cell for the rest of his life. I heard a key turn in the front door. David was back. He had forgotten his briefcase. I looked at the screen, then at the door, as the heavy thud of his footsteps approached the study. The study door creaked open, and David stepped in, his silhouette framed by the hallway light. He froze when he saw me sitting in his chair, the glow of the laptop screen illuminating my face like a ghost. For a heartbeat, the air vanished from the room. I could see the exact moment he realized the safe was open. His face didn't just turn pale, it turned a sickly, translucent gray, the mask of the confident mogul melting away to reveal the terrified boy underneath. "Elena, what are you doing?" he asked, his voice cracking. He tried to step forward, but his legs seemed heavy, uncooperative. I didn't move. I didn't even blink. I just pointed at the screen, at the grainy photo of the warehouse ruins and the scanned confession from 30 years ago. The silence was absolute, broken only by the frantic, uneven rhythm of his breathing. The smell of his young citrus cologne was now overwhelmed by the metallic scent of his fear. He reached for the laptop, but I slammed it shut with a sharp clack that sounded like a judge's gavel. "You built our life on a grave, David," I whispered. My voice was steady, a terrifying contrast to the earthquake happening inside my chest. He stumbled back against the mahogany bookshelf, his hand clutching a row of leather-bound law books for support. He looked at me as if he were seeing a stranger, and in a way he was. The submissive, quiet wife was gone. "It was an accident, Elena. It went wrong," he stammered, the words tumbling out in a desperate, pathetic rush. "I did it for us. I did it so we could have everything." He looked at the safe, then back at me, his eyes pleading. But I saw the truth now. He hadn't done it for us. He'd done it for himself, and I was just the witness he'd kept close to stay safe. The man I loved was a fiction. The monster was the reality. David sank into the leather armchair opposite the desk, his expensive suit suddenly looking 3 sizes too big for him. He began to weep, not the deep, soul-cleansing tears of a man who is sorry, but the panicked, shallow sobs of a man who has been caught. He offered me money. He offered me the Cayman accounts, the house, the cars, everything he had spent the last decade trying to steal from me. He was bargaining for his life, and it was the most pathetic thing I had ever seen. "I'll leave her, Elena," he choked out, wiping his nose with a silk handkerchief. "I'll break it off with Mia. We can go back to how it was. Just please, delete the drive, please." I looked at him and felt a cold, distant pity. He thought this was still about the girl. He thought he could just swap one life for another like he was trading stocks. He didn't understand that once you see the monster, you can never go back to believing in the man. I stood up, the USB drive clutched tightly in my palm. The plastic was warm from the computer's heat, feeling like a live coal. How it was? I asked, my voice rising for the first time. How it was a lie. Every dinner, every vacation, every time you touched me, you were thinking about the man you left in that fire. You were thinking about how much longer you could keep the secret. I walked around the desk until I was standing over him. He reached out to grab my hand, his fingers cold and trembling. I pulled away as if his skin were poisonous. I realized then that my 27 years of loyalty weren't a gift I'd given to him. They were a prison sentence I served for a crime I didn't commit. "I'm not staying because I love you, David," I said, my voice dropping to a low, lethal hum. "And I'm not leaving because you found someone younger." "Then what do you want?" he whispered, his eyes wide and vacant. I sat back down in the high-backed chair, the seat of power in this room. I opened the secret ledger I'd found earlier, the one detailing the millions he'd moved to the offshore accounts. I took a pen from his gold desk set, the weight of it familiar and solid in my hand. I began to write a list. I didn't want a divorce. I didn't want a generous settlement. I wanted everything. I told him I would stay in the house and he would stay too, in the guest wing. He would continue to run the firm, but every cent of profit would be moved into an account only I could access. He would break up with Mia, but he would tell her it was because he was bankrupt. I wanted him to see the look on her young, energetic face when she realized the fountain of youth didn't come with a credit card. I wanted him to live in the empire he'd built, but as a ghost in his own hallways. David stared at me, his mouth hanging open. He looked at the USB drive in my hand, then at the list I'd written. He knew I had him. If I went to the police, the statute of limitations on the embezzlement might have passed, but the murder charges wouldn't. He would spend his final years in a concrete cell, stripped of the luxury that was his only identity. He was trapped in a cage of his own making, and I was the one holding the key. "You're a monster," he breathed, a flicker of his old arrogance returning for a fleeting second. I smiled then, a small, sharp movement that didn't reach my eyes. "I'm your wife, David. You taught me everything I know about survival." The next morning, the house was silent, but it was a different kind of silence. It was the silence of a siege. I watched from the upstairs window as David stood on the driveway, making the phone call I had ordered him to make. Even from a distance, I could see his shoulders slumped, his head bowed. He was ending it with Mia. I couldn't hear the words, but I saw him wince, likely as she screamed or hung up on him. The citrus cologne was gone. He smelled of old sweat and desperation now. When he came back inside, he didn't head for the kitchen or his study. He headed for the guest room. We didn't speak as we passed each other in the hall. He looked at the floor, his eyes avoiding mine as if I were a sun too bright to look at. I went into his old study and began the process of moving the funds. My fingers moved across the keyboard with a precision I didn't know I possessed. It was surprisingly easy to dismantle a man's life when you had his passwords and his terror. By noon, the Cayman accounts were no longer his. By 2, the shell company had a new sole director, Elena Vance. I felt a strange, cold buzzing under my skin, a sense of power that was intoxicating and horrifying all at once. I looked at the wedding photos on the mantel, the young couple smiling in the sun. I realized I didn't recognize either of them. They were just 2 more victims of the fire David had started 30 years ago. I heard a knock at the front door. It wasn't David's loafers. It was a heavy, rhythmic thud. I looked at the security monitor. 2 men in dark suits were standing on the porch. They weren't police. They were the family of the man who had died in the warehouse fire. The air in the hallway turned to ice. I didn't call out for David. I simply watched the monitor. The 2 men stood with a stillness that suggested they had waited decades for this moment. The taller one had white hair and a jawline that looked like it was carved from granite. He was the image of the mentor David had murdered, just 30 years older. This was the son. I could feel my pulse throbbing in my fingertips as I opened the door. "Is he here?" he asked. His voice was a low rumble, devoid of anger but heavy with a weary, relentless justice. He didn't need to state his name. The resemblance was a confession in itself. I looked past him at the quiet street, realizing that David's secrets hadn't just been sitting on a USB drive, they had been walking the earth, breathing and hunting. I stepped aside, signaling them into the foyer. The smell of the rain they'd brought in with them was sharp and honest. David came to the top of the stairs, clutching the railing as if he might fall. When he saw the men, the little color left in his face vanished. He didn't deny it. He didn't ask who they were. He simply sat down on the top step and buried his face in his hands. The empire hadn't been toppled by a younger woman or a disgruntled wife. It was collapsing under the weight of a 30-year-old shadow. The white-haired man looked at me, then at the opulence of our home, the marble floors, the crystal, the mahogany. He said, "We didn't come for the police," he said softly, his eyes locking onto mine. "The police can't give us back what he took. We came for the ledger." My heart skipped. They knew about the siphoned millions. They weren't looking for a trial. They were looking for a settlement of blood and gold. We sat in the study, the four of us. The atmosphere was thick, like the air before a devastating storm. David sat in the corner, a broken shell of a man, while I sat behind his desk. I realized then that I was the one negotiating his life for the second time in 24 hours. The son of the dead man laid a folder on the desk. It contained the same records I had found, but with one addition: proof that they had been tracking David's offshore movements for years. "He thought he was hiding it from you," he said, gesturing toward David, "but he was actually building a bank account for us. He just didn't know it yet." They wanted everything, not just the Cayman accounts I had seized, but the house, the firm, and the very pension David had spent 27 years protecting. They were stripping him naked, leaving him with nothing but the clothes on his back and the air in his lungs. David looked at me, a desperate, silent plea in his eyes. He wanted me to use the USB drive. He wanted me to threaten them, to fight for our money. But I looked at the white-haired man and saw the decades of grief he had carried, while David drank expensive wine and bought diamonds for mistresses. The moral weight of the fire was sitting on the desk between us, and it was heavier than any pile of gold. "Take it," I said. The word was a whisper, but it carried the finality of a guillotine. David let out a choked sound, a strangled cry of protest, but I didn't look at him. I pushed the laptop toward the man. The passwords, the transfers, the deeds, it's all there. Everything he built is yours. It always was. The man nodded slowly, a grim satisfaction settling over his features. David was left with nothing: no empire, no wife, and no mistress. 1 week later, the moving trucks were gone. The house was an echoing shell, stripped of the art and the furniture that David had used to dress up his crimes. He was gone too. I had given him a few $1,000s, just enough to find a small apartment in a part of the city he used to despise. He had left without a word, his citrus cologne replaced by the smell of defeat and stale tobacco. I stood in the center of the empty living room, the late afternoon sun casting long, skeletal shadows across the hardwood. I was alone, but for the first time in 27 years, I wasn't lonely. The silence was no longer a vacuum. It was a clean slate. I looked at my reflection in the darkened window. I saw the lines around my eyes, the silver in my hair, and the steadiness in my gaze. I wasn't the replaced wife. I was the survivor who had seen the monster and lived to tell the tale. I had kept one thing, not the money. I had given the rest to a foundation for victims of industrial accidents. I kept the USB drive. It sat in my pocket, a small weight that reminded me of the truth. David had wanted someone younger because he thought a younger woman wouldn't have the history to see who he really was. He wanted someone who didn't know where the bodies were buried. But he forgot that a woman who grows old with you is the only one who truly knows the cost of your soul. I walked to the front door and turned off the lights. As I stepped out into the cool evening air, I didn't look back. The fire was finally out. Some truths don't set you free. They simply leave you standing in the ruins of who you thought you were. I learned that night that loyalty to a lie is the most expensive mistake a heart can make. They say time heals, but I think time only reveals what was hidden in the dark. If this story touched you, stay with me for the next one. Subscribe, like, share it with someone who would feel it, and leave your thoughts in the comments. My 10 p.m. stories. One story every night at 10 p.m.